Hi, Nick Biron at 360 Insights. And today's video, I wanted to talk about really kind of the power of third-party independent research content. I know for a research firm, kind of talking about ourselves, not a big fan of doing it too often. But at the end of the day, I wanted to share an experience I had with one of our customers that really for me, runs home the whole concept of using third-party independent research to support an organization's marketing. So let's face it, if you look at, for example, case studies, 360 Insights does case studies, but also we know that solution providers, they do their own case studies as well. And then there are several content providers that will also create case studies on top of that. And a lot of the times when speaking with solution providers about the services that we provide here at 360 Insights, I get the why would we do a case study with you versus just create one on our own? And it's always a very valid question. And there's typically a few things that I really hone in on. And then one of them I really want to talk about today because, as I mentioned, it came up with the customer. So the first one is when it comes down to the research that we do in the case studies or anatomy of decisions when we're talking to an end user and interviewing them, I typically find that we go much deeper than your traditional case study that a solution provider may do or a content writer may do. Because at the end of the day, the team here, we're experts at the various spaces that we cover, but we also have a lot of experience in terms of just understanding the decision making process, understanding the value of software and technology. So when we talk to these individuals, we really try to understand their situation, what is really driving the need for change. What was the things that they were evaluating as part of that change? Who are the providers? And as we go along, there's an art to the way that we ask questions that's able to really uncover some great information around what's the drivers for change, what were the things that they were evaluating as part of that solutions selection, who are the vendors, but then ultimately when we get into even the case studies, it's really providing and understanding the value of software and technology and impact it's had on an organization. And I find that is dramatically different than a lot of solution providers. They typically have a very difficult time getting that impact. And it's just because the way that we ask questions is a little bit different. Because at the end of the day, what I find is that if most organizations actually went into a deployment with a way to measure success, 360 Insights would probably be out of business. But the reality is, a lot of organizations out there, as they go through their own journey, they may build a business case for why they need something. But once it's been deployed, they really actually don't measure how to the impact and success it may have in an organization. So in the end, we find that it's a bit of art in the way that we ask the questions that's able to get that information out. So that's one aspect. We find that the case studies and anatomy of decisions that we do are traditionally much more robust than your traditional vendor or, like I said, content writer's case study. The other thing that I find is because we're third party, we're independent, a lot of organizations will utilize the case studies and stories that they're part of as a way to validate their own internal decision making process. It's a way of validating that they made the right decision within their organization. And they'll use it as a way to do that. Also, they typically end up starting to use it as a way to showcase investments that they're making in their organization that are really trying to help their team and their organization move forward in a better direction. And then finally, I wouldn't say finally, but also we see that a lot of the people that participate, the actual interview candidates, when they see the case study go live, they see a lot of value in that, in their own voice being used to really support something like a piece of research. And find that quite often a lot of them will support the research on social media, but typically start to list it as featured content on their LinkedIn pages, and they start to use it as part of their resume and repertoire. So what I always find is that when someone wants to participate in a 360 Insights piece of research, and I'm sure this is the same with other research firms, I'm just happen to be talking about 360 Insights now, is that there's a lot of value in participating in these research reports. And they typically use that, like I said, as a way to elevate themselves in a way that helps them propel their own selves and career forward as well. But the last aspect, the one that I want to really talk about today is it actually creates a more defendable piece of research. Excuse me, piece of content and customer story. And let me explain this because this is a situation that happened actually not today, but the other day, where we actually published an anatomy of a decision. And long story short, in that anatomy of a decision, we profiled one end user's decision to move forward with a specific vendor. However, throughout that process, it was very interesting because they actually started their journey with two vendors, vendor A, vendor B. I'm not going to name names. And throughout their journey, they realized that vendor A, sorry, they weren't providing the value that they were hoping for. They were talking about many issues due to pricing and price increases and surprise price hikes, issues with customer service and not getting very good turnaround times, and even limitations in the solution that they were using versus vendor B, where they found it to be a much more robust service. And at the same time, they were getting better responses from the customer support team and success team and account management teams. But at the end of the day, as part of this organization's journey, they realized they needed to make a change. They realized that they wanted to use a software or a solution to really help them take a more proactive approach in the way that they were going to market. And as part of this, they actually went out and evaluated vendor A and vendor B, and also along with, I think, 3 or 4 other vendors. Ultimately, long story short, they ended up picking vendor B. When we published the anatomy of a decision, vendor A got wind of the anatomy of a decision that we published and went directly to vendor B and said that A, that they weren't a client, and that B, that they should be pulling down the research because it's not a valid piece of research. Now, traditionally, if this had been something that was done either by a writer or even by the vendor themselves, they probably would have been forced to pull that report down. Because at the end of the day, it is very difficult to defend something that you create yourself. With that, the customer actually came to 360 Insights and asked us if we had more background, if we could share more insight. And the interesting aspect is, even though vendor A was denying that this customer had ever used their platform, we had plenty of evidence that showcased that they were. We had the actual recording and transcript of the interview that we had with this customer. On top of that, we actually had email confirmation from the customer, not only that they reviewed the draft of the research, but they actually asked for some alterations around the voice that they were using and tone towards vendor A. They'd actually asked us to tone down the research when it came to how we were presenting vendor A in the research. They didn't want to seem too harsh, and we were completely happy to comply with that. In the end, we were able to help this organization, vendor B, defend the research that that they licensed from 360 Insights and that they were using as part of their go-to-market strategy. Because at the end of the day, we had not just the fact that we're third party and independent, we don't have a horse in the race, but at the same time, we were able to defend the research content based upon the actual voice of the customer, having that in our repository of interviews that we typically keep on hand. And at the same time, the ability to have the end user actually review the research before we went live to confirm that, in fact, what we had showcased in the research that was published was indeed true. On top of that, I'll even share a side story that when we found out that the customer was having a lot of issues with the vendor A, we know vendor A. We actually know several executives within vendor A. I've reached out to them twice personally and asked them, and well, not even asked them, but asked them to have time where I could share with them what we learned. Not to name names because I don't want to give off customers that have actually, confided in us their stories, but actually just to kind of share with them the experiences that that particular customer had and the reason why they were actually leaving that platform for another vendor. So at the end of the day, what I really wanted to showcase is the fact that I know that solution providers and content writers, they can write case studies. They can even write anatomy of decisions, and they can write other customer-based stories. And at the end of the day, I think there's absolutely a place in the marketing repertoire that an organization may use to support their sales and marketing functions. But at the same time, I also believe that there's a path for research content as well, especially because at the end of the day, we are third party and independent, not just 360 Insights, but other research firms out there. And when we produce something, it's got a little bit more rigor to it than a traditional piece of content that might be written. We spend a lot of time getting to know these organizations. We have a lot of background on the industry that they support and the software that they're using. And there's also just background in terms of how we actually have our strategies in the way that we actually go to market around conducting these interviews to really pull out and abstract a lot of information from them. So the end result happens to be a much more robust study on a customer deployment and success. But then at the same time, we find that there's a lot of value to the end user who participates that use it for a way to validate what they've done internally, that they've made the right decisions. They use it as a way to kind of bolster themselves within their executive team to showcase that. They also use it externally as a way to really support them in a way that helps bolster their own personal branding, whether it's in terms of career development or just getting general exposure. But again, I also think that one of the more important parts is it's defendable. At the end of the day, if a vendor goes to market with something that they wrote, it becomes very difficult to defend, especially if it happens to profile competitive usage. So again, thank you so much for taking the time. I wanted to share this because it's something that came up and, at the end of the day, it's very important to me that we can create very defendable research content, and I will stand up for anything that we publish for our customers. And this was just one case where that came up. Thank you for taking the time.